This video was made possible by Wix. If you're ready to create a website, head over to wix.com/go/infographics to try out one of their premium plans right now. In November of 1939, under the guise of securing Leningrad, Russian forces invaded neutral Finland, sparking off a 3-month war versus their much smaller neighbors. Despite overwhelming advantages in numbers, weapons, and logistics, the Russian offensive was badly mauled and Russia only managed meager gains for their disastrous efforts, most of which were promptly retaken years later. What would happen though if Russia decided it wants another crack at Finland? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're taking a look at what would happen if Russia invaded Finland. The Winter War of 1939 was a disastrous affair that humiliated the Soviet military. Emboldened by a non-aggression pact with Germany, and thus free from worrying about a German invasion, Russia sought to force neutral Finland into major territorial and economic concessions. Chief amongst these was a demand for substantial border territory between the two nations under the guise of helping ensure the security of Leningrad, which was only 20 miles from the Finnish border. Widely denounced by the rest of the world order for sheer preposterousness of needing to secure Leningrad from neutral Finland, Russia went through with its demands and, when Finland refused, launched a military invasion. However, having purged the ranks of its military for fear of capitalist or imperial sympathizers and other undesirables to the new Soviet order, Russia went to war with crippling deficiencies in its senior and junior military leadership. The Russian invasion force consisted of between 425,000 to 760,000 soldiers, with 2,514 to 6,514 tanks and 3,880 aircraft. The Finnish defenders, on the other hand, numbered at 300,000 to 340,000, with 32 tanks and 114 aircraft. Completely outnumbering Finland's forces and up against a nation with no real tank or air forces to speak of, Stalin expected a swift defeat of Finland, but ended up achieving nothing more than a Pyrrhic victory, making the same blunder as the Germans would years later against himself. Stalin launched his offensive just as winter was taking hold, a mistake which would cost him upwards of 61,000 casualties to the cold alone. His political purges of military leadership compounded the inexperienced Soviet military's problem, and weak leadership led to massive defeats or extremely costly gains against the much better organized and led Finnish defenders. For their part, the Finns mounted a surprisingly stiff resistance and fought both a conventional and asymmetric war, often allowing Soviet troops to penetrate deep into their territory before retaliating with militias and parliamentary forces on the Soviet rear and their supply lines. These tactics proved devastatingly successful, extracting a toll from the invaders of up to 168,000 dead, 207,000 wounded, and the loss of up to 3,543 tanks and 515 aircraft. Finland, on the other hand, suffered only up to 26,000 dead, 44,000 wounded, and lost up to 30 tanks and 62 aircraft. Inevitably though, superior Soviet numbers overwhelmed the Finnish defenders, and Finland was forced to sign a peace treaty which saw the cessation of approximately 11% of its territory to the Soviet Union. While technically a victory, the war of aggression cost Stalin dearly by swaying international support towards Finland and later in World War II, limiting the amount of aid the Allies were willing to provide the Soviets, costing them thousands of lives lost. The war also signaled to Hitler that the Soviet Union was a paper tiger, its armed forces inexperienced and poorly led, and thus encouraged him to years later go ahead with his plans to invade. Had Stalin not invaded Finland, the weakness of his military may have never been exposed, and Hitler may have never decided to invade. Or if he had, international public opinion wouldn't have been so firmly against the Soviet Union and greater military aid could have been given by the Allies. In the end, Stalin won territorial concessions from Finland, but at the price of hundreds of thousands of casualties in his Finnish War, and many more later in his conflict against Germany. So what would happen if modern Russia decided to try their hand at a new winter war? First, it's unlikely that this would happen. After suffering numerous invasions throughout their history, the Russian people take a very dim view of nations invading other nations. Even the Russian invasion of Chechnya met with serious public resistance. Whatever political will might exist to launch an aggressive war would be quickly met with stiff domestic resistance. However, Putin has made it clear that Russia's democracy is only so in name, and with a firm grip on the reins of power, he could order an invasion if he so wished. Though the motives would be less than clear. Finland holds no major strategic value for Russia, and its reserves of coal, gas, and oil are dwarfed by Russia's own. An invasion would only serve to further isolate Russia from the world and stir up international anger and resolve against it. But one reason to invade may be Finland's continued flirtation with joining NATO. Though not a member, Finland is a NATO partner and has taken part in NATO's efforts in Afghanistan and its fight against the Islamic State. While only 22% of the Finnish population supports joining NATO, over 50% support close cooperation, and Finnish President Sauli Niinistö recently proposed a possible NATO membership. With its political clout, a major portion of the population could swing to support NATO ascension. Russia would take an extremely dim view of this, to say the least. Finland's ascension to NATO would place NATO forces along an 833-mile border with Russia and increase the scope of any political conflict zone in a NATO-Russia war. Outnumbered and outgunned, Russia's strength in a NATO-Russia conflict has always been its ability to mass forces in a relatively small geographic area. Striking north through Estonia to Poland and forcing a confrontation in Germany, the small geographic scope of such a conflict would favor a heavy Russian buildup, specifically with US forces making up the bulk of the Allegiance's firepower, and taking weeks to get to Europe. Yet if Finland joined the alliance, it would give NATO a much larger geographic area to operate in, and suddenly massing its forces in just one battlefield would leave Russia critically vulnerable to incursions from the north. It is, and always has been, in Russia's best interest to keep NATO at arm's length and to ensure that the majority of fighting could only happen on German battlefields. Russia simply can't afford to fight a war with broad fronts, let alone one where NATO armor could penetrate deep into the heart of Russia from the Finnish border. Yet, Russia's continued aggression against the democratic systems of European and American elections and its hostilities in the South Ossetia and Ukraine may signal that it's time for Europe to stand united and ensure that the 21st century remains a peaceful one. As a current NATO partner, Finland cooperates with NATO forces, but does not enjoy Article 5 protection. An attack on one is considered an attack on all. This leaves Finland critically vulnerable to future Russian aggression should it come. And to deter that aggression, it may be prudent for Finland to seriously consider joining the alliance. With Russia fielding a military that is over 1 million strong versus Finland's mere 29,000, if Russia decided it did want to invade Finland, it would face very little resistance. And this would not be the clunky, poorly led army of the early Soviet Union. Though still having serious deficiencies to include training, large amounts of outdated equipment, and the majority of its forces being conscripts with poor morale, Russia fields a far more capable military than it did during the Winter War. Its ground force of 20,000 battle tanks is supported by an air force made up of 818 fighters, 1,216 attack aircraft, and 511 attack helicopters. By comparison, Finland could respond with a meager force of only 160 tanks, 55 multi-purpose fighters, and no attack helicopters whatsoever. Though Finland did manage to mount an effective defense of its territory during the Winter War, the nature of modern war is far evolved from the pre-World War II era, and the Finnish military simply lacks the technological sophistication to mount an effective resistance against superior Russian assets. NATO would likely respond to a Russian invasion of a neutral country, but even if it did manage to vote for full war against Russia, the alliance could not mobilize enough forces in time to prevent a complete Russian takeover of Finland. In all likelihood, a blitzkrieg attack by Russian forces would see the nation fall in a matter of days, followed by the installation of a puppet government which would sue NATO for peace. Holding Finland hostage, public opinion would turn against NATO if it forced a costly and devastating counter-invasion, which would decimate the Finnish economy and countryside both. Standing alone as it currently does leaves Finland vulnerable, yet suing for membership within NATO could provoke exactly the aggression Finland is seeking to prevent. Yet Russia hasn't shown much willingness to mount full-scale invasions of major European powers, and has to date limited its aggression to political tampering and small annexations of territory from unaligned minor nations. It's highly likely that if Russia invaded Finland, not only would it face international opposition, but internal ones as well, as the Russian people rose up in anger against a warmongering government. As one Russian put it, "We should invade Finland only with our tourists. It's a beautiful country." War can be a terrifying thing to consider, but one war you shouldn't hesitate to join is the war on bad websites. Don't let your personal site be one of the millions out there with a terrible design. Call for reinforcements from Wix and get a stunning website today. With fully customizable templates, Wix makes building a great site simple, fun, and fast. Create a website today by going to wix.com/go/infographics or by clicking the link in the description. You'll not only be getting a great website, you'll also be supporting the Infographics Show in the process, enabling us to make more great videos on more serious topics. Don't wait until it's too late. Get a head start today with the amazing website you deserve.